until you...
Thanks for calling that out. I just started the recording.
Thank you. So here's our content. We're going to be looking at the rationale and principles for a meta-analysis. We're going to look at the steps of conducting one, planning the review, preparing your data, and then we're going to be talking about assessing bias and study quality. I really like the idea of bias because of how loaded a meaning it has. So let's go to the next. And so So question is, let's start with the why. Simon Sinek, if you guys know him, popularized this concept of what is your why. Anyway, so let's talk about a why for systematic reviews and meta-analysis. And on the left, why do we conduct reviews inclusive of systematic analysis? And I want to start from the point at the bottom here, is that systematic reviews and meta-analysis provide the highest level of research evidence ever, to use a new pop cultural language. So here's the thing. When you're arguing with your friends, you would say, oh, I read in one paper, I read a study, and and people say, okay, so that's evidence. But is that conclusive evidence? And the answer is no. One study is not conclusive evidence. And so in places like the US, they have an organization called the USPTFS or something, United States Preventive Task Force. Now, this organization does systematic reviews and meta-analyses, and it basically looks at evidence across different studies, and it uses that evidence to generate what the truth is. For example, does eating roasted groundnuts cause throat cancer? Maybe one study would have found, yes, it does. Another would have said no. And so organizations take all the evidence across all the studies, perform systematic reviews and meta-analysis, and then they can provide advice or recommendations to US government institutions, to medical health systems, and say, this is the truth so far as we know about whether roasted groundnuts cause throat cancer. So one study is not conclusive evidence. The systematic review is the highest, and meta-analysis is at the highest type of evidence that can be presented. So there's the other whys, of course, and I mentioned earlier before the recording started that you want to understand what the evidence gap is, and you want to use that to inform your research agenda. If there's already conclusive evidence on whatever topic, do you want to do yet another meta-analysis? And what's this one? Overview of available evidence to guide programs and communicate to teams. So this is very similar to the next one. You need to know what has been done. You need to know what the results of what has been done are before you can say, well, here's what we're going to do in the future. Now, why is, I want you to notice that here we did not say systematic reviews, we said reviews, and here we said systematic review. So what is a review? And a review really is just like sometimes or most times they are narrative. So a doctor can say, I want to talk about breast cancer patients that I've seen. I want to talk about breast cancer, the types of breast cancer, its treatment, what people are doing, and just write it out. So that is a review of a disease area. But a systematic review is a systematic review because it's systematic. Yes, that was a joke, if you get it. But the point about what makes a systematic review stand out is the objectiveness with which you pursue or you implement one. And so if you look at this point, the evidence is more likely to be complete and comprehensive, thus minimizing bias. The methods are not only transparent, the methods are kind of set in stone, and we're going to see that as we go on. Of course, it is more objective. You've looked at the breadth of evidence from everywhere as much as possible. And then you could include this really fine thing called the meta-analysis, which is a quantitative estimation of truth. So you're going to ask and say, well, all the times I've learned about epi and bio, people do not talk about truth. And I just want to share with you that science came out of philosophy, and philosophy is concerned with what is the truth about things. And that is my mindset when I think about research. You want to know the truth about whether smoking causes cancer. And not only do you want to know the truth, you want to quantify that truth. So bear with me if you wonder, why is this guy talking about truth? It is the principle behind research. So let's move on. So this is exactly what I've been saying in the previous slide. And you can see as we go up, so a doctor writes a case report. The doctor sees a patient who has a growth that looks like a cauliflower from their underarm. I thought there was a question. Okay. So a doctor sees something that looks like a cauliflower kind growth in the underarm of a patient. And so they write it up. And so that's a case report, an opinion, letters. Oh, by the way, I don't know if many of you have seen Dope Sick, but the contention of the people who got into trouble in Dope Sick was that they used evidence from a letter. Can you imagine to create a multi-million or multi-billion drug complex that ended up killing people? A letter, that is the lowest of the low. It's like, how are you? Do you know that smoking causes cancer? And then we develop drugs or we develop policies. But anyway, you start from the bottom and you go all the way. So you can see randomized controlled trials. You probably heard people say RCTs are the gold standard. Yes, they are the gold standard for primary research, but we are talking again about evidence generation and evidence to inform perhaps policy, because research by itself alone is not useful. Research that is applied to the population, research that is applied to policy is useful, and you have meta-analyses and systematic reviews ahead of that. And so a meta-analysis, a systematic review may or may not include a meta-analysis, but what is the fun of doing that? If you do a systematic review, maybe you should as well go all the way, but who knows? Okay, someone says they are not hearing. Maybe you should restart your computer. I don't know, but a quick check. Is everyone hearing what I am saying?
Yes, we can hear.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah, it's okay.
Great. Okay, so there are more reasons, and these are now the quantitative and technical reasons. And so let's go over them really quickly. So I try to explain technical things without using jargon. So I will try my very best. And so to estimate average causal effects. I know that Ibrahim loves this word because epidemiologists are concerned with causes. Did it cause? Did X cause Y? I don't care about causation as much. I just want to know what the relationship is. But of course, remember we're talking about truth. And we said, for example, does roasted groundnuts or peanuts, as some people call them, cause throat cancer? And so the question is, yes or no, but you don't want to stop there. You want to know the degree to which. And so you would say, so yes, we realize, or yes, we find that it is true, and the degree to which it is true is 3 times as much or 10 times as much as those people who do not take roasted groundnuts. Okay, to identify the sources of heterogeneity in causal effects, including the dose of exposure. So the systematic review that I have been involved with and meta-analysis looked at how much does tea, or what effect tea, the drinking of tea, have on cardiovascular outcomes. And what we found out was that different studies that looked at tea did different things. Some people had you drink 4 cups, some people had you drink 2 cups, some people had you drink 10 cups. Some people did that in healthy people, some people did that in people with cardiovascular disease. And so this causes heterogeneity. It basically means that your PICO, if you remember your PICO, we'll get to that as well as a refresher, could be, there could be overlap, but there also could be dispersion. And that introduces what you call heterogeneity in your studies. And so if you're compiling evidence from multiple studies and they're all different from one another, how can you then arrive at truth? So we keep going back to that word. Okay, so to pull prevalence incidence estimates, yes. So this is a very epidemiologic line, and it's very useful because how do you know, for example, how many people have systematic lupus erythematosus? Oh, that's a really big word. I'm happy I pronounced that in one breath. How do you know across the world, if you were a rheumatologist and you were interested in getting the WHO to recognize it as some kind of a priority disease, you would need to pull estimates. And remember that studies are often done either at state level, at community level, maybe not so much at national level, talk less of international level. So you would need to pull estimates from different studies that are done across the globe and put them and say to the WHO, Dr. Tedros, we believe that there are 400 million people or there are 1.2 billion people in this world suffering from SLE. Give us money to make this intervention and treat and heal everybody, or whatever it is you say in your grants. To compare drug interventions. So we might skip this one just because of time, but let me give it a go. Since I do this, this is the kind of work that I do. So in a trial, you compare drug A to placebo, and then you say drug A is so much better than placebo. Good job. But another person is going to compare drug B with placebo, and the placebo with placebo basically, and they're going to say drug B is better than placebo. But do we know what a drug A, how drug A compares to drug B? You know that both of them are better than placebo, but how do you know that paracetamol is better than ibuprofen for using fevers in children? You need to do an indirect comparison, and a meta-analysis can help you with that. In fact, indirect treatment comparisons, I believe, are a subset of meta-analysis. Can Dahiru Labaran mute himself? Thank you very much. Okay, so let's move on. How am I doing with time?
I think if you could pick up the pace a bit.
Pick up the pace. Great. Okay, great. Yeah. Okay, so let's jump right into it. And so there are 9 steps that can be broken down into 3. You know, if anyone knows the Pinto framework, you know, it's your group, your sort, your list, or something like that. And this kind of models it. There are 9 steps, but you can see that you can break them down, or you can aggregate into 3. So you plan your review, you identify the need, and you develop your protocol. You conduct the actual review and you disseminate the review. Remember, there's no point conducting research if you don't put it out there. So put it out there, folks. And so we're going to go right into them. So when you how do you identify the need for a review? And you come back to your basic EpiBio principles of your PICO, your population or participant, your intervention or your exposure, and your comparator or your outcomes. Can we have one person? There's a Febi Tambala Jameson. I really like that name. If you're available, that is, there's no background noise. Can you unmute yourself and answer a question for us? Okay, I see that you're unmuted. How are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well, Phoebe. Okay, so Phoebe, tell me, are you familiar with the PICO framework?
Yes, I am.
Sweet. Okay, so let's look at this second line here. Tell me which is the P, which is the I, which is the C, which is the O. Let's do it. You have 10 seconds. Let's go.
Okay, HIV patients is the P.
Okay.
Yeah, and the intervention heart, the ART drug.
Okay.
The intervention should be safe.
The what? You said the intervention is a HART? Okay.
The HRT is the the HRT is the intervention.
Okay.
Yes. The comparator is those without sex.
Okay. By sex here, they mean gender, by the way. Just oops.
Oh, okay, sorry. All right. And the outcome is the risk of AIDS.
All right, great. Does anyone disagree? This was a trick question, by the way, Phoebe, so I set you up, right? Sorry?
No, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. You did an excellent job. You did an excellent job, and thank you. So I see a hand raised, so let's get that quickly, and then okay. And let's move forward. So Phoebe, you did a great job. But I kind of laid a trap, which is why I chose the second one, not the third one. Glory, you have your hand raised. If you unmute yourself very quickly so that we move forward.
Okay, yeah, for the second one, right, does the risk of AIDS differ by sex among HIV patients on heart? So the population and participant is HIV patients.
Okay.
And then the risk of AIDS is the outcome.
Okay.
So the heart is the intervention.
Okay. So that's exactly what Phoebe said. And I see that Umo Mfonobong has a hand up, but I'm going to move on. I was trying to say that this is a trick question because the real population is not HIV patients, but HIV patients on heart. So if you were trying to understand whether, so think about this, an HIV patient that's not on heart would have a different risk of AIDS from one that is on heart. So the population is HIV patients on heart. There is no intervention here. You just want to see the comparator, of course, is, I believe, since we're using sex, male versus female. Does it differ? The risk of AIDS is the outcome. Does the outcome differ males versus females? In who? Not just in HIV patients, but those being treated with highly active antiretroviral therapy. So this is what we're saying about heterogeneity earlier. So when you pull in, can we have Mahmood on mute, because there's some background noise. So when you're pulling in your studies, and we're going to see that as we go along, you're going to find out that maybe you're looking at just HIV patients, or some of them on ART, or some of them are not very adherent to their medications. And so you need to, and that's going to introduce a whole lot of heterogeneity. Okay. Thank you. And so, but before, so now that you have your PICO very clear, and try to practice this. What is a real PICO? Is your PICO very clear? Is it very specific? Are we identifying populations correctly, etc., etc.? So for this question, I could add HIV on HART who are adherent. And we know that adherence is about 80%. You take your drug 80% of the time, blah, 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 blah. And let's go on. But before when you do that, you also want to know, has it been done already? But has it been done, and was it done many years ago? So you want to do an update. Is there a need for evaluation of heterogeneity? We just spoke about that. Is there a subgroup of interest? So I was telling you about the tea study. So you want to look, sometimes you want to look at tea drinking generally, but then you might want to look at their particular patients we should be looking at. For example, people who already have this outcome of cardiovascular disease. Okay, so let's move on. I know that they told me to become faster, but I think I've actually become slower. So the next thing is for you to develop your review protocol. Okay, so let me tell you one of the things that you can see Prisma here, and where you want to follow Prisma guidelines, but there's here this sentence: it is best practice to register your review protocol. And here's the reason: you want to look for bias when you're looking at studies. Excuse me. And one of the things that could introduce bias, and we're going to talk a little, we'll do a refresher on what bias means. One of the things that could introduce bias is that your evidence is generated after post hoc. And what we mean is as opposed to a priori. So you want to look at whether people eating roasted peanuts get throat cancer. And you start doing the research, and then you find out that, oh, maybe it's people who, I don't know, eat roasted cashew nuts or whatever. And then you suddenly switch and say, oh, your findings were that it was roasted cashew nuts. You kind of it's like you're fishing, and then you finally produce something that is statistically significant. But when you register, when you write out your protocol and you register, then everybody can be certain that this result was done a priori. And one of the reasons why you should not fish is something called I believe it's called I forgot the name, but it's a type 1 error, where if you keep fishing, you will find something statistically significant, not because it is the truth, but because of those errors. Is it called pairwise error? I think it's called pairwise error, but let's move on. So I talked about Prisma, and I talked about what makes systematic reviews and meta-analysis very objective. It's because there are organizations which have come together to say, hey, we need a standard. We need a standard for the presentation of research, especially research in systematic reviews. So, and one of those organizations is Prisma. I'm not sure who's in charge of Prisma, but they're huge and people use them. And this is the 2020, this is the latest update of their checklist. It's the 2020 checklist. And when we share the slides, we have a link here. You can see you can go to the link and check them out. And this has all the things you need to put into your systematic review for it to be standard. One of the unintended consequences of these frameworks is that you can pick up a paper and immediately you know where to go to find what you are looking for. So if you're ever given an assignment to critically review a paper and you don't have all the time to read the entire paper, you can skim. And if you skim using a good framework, you know where the aim and objective is. You know where the statistical analysis is. You know where to look for the results. But this is not the class to show that. So after you've developed your protocol, you've done your PICO, you've checked blah blah blah. Is this an update? Is this fresh? Is this? And you've registered your protocol. You now have to do the work, and you want to develop a literature set. So we say look at least 3 different databases. And you can see here PubMed. I was told by someone who actually does systematic reviews to inform policy for the US government, that in PubMed has 90% of all the studies that you would find everywhere else. So PubMed is definitely one that you should have in your set. But there's also MBase, there's also the Cochrane. And Cochrane is a really great organization, so you should check them out. And I believe they only review randomized control trials. That's in their name, isn't it? Cochrane Register of Control Trials. Africa Journals Online. I like that. Thank you very much for putting it. Can Sharon mute herself? We can we can hear the background noise of the train of the vehicle that you are in. And Google Scholar. So when I first started my doctoral program, people said, do not use Google Scholar, but man, my goodness, Google Scholar is the way to go. Maybe I didn't say that, maybe I said that, but it is the way to go, I promise you. PubMed, Google Scholar, maybe Embase, I think you agree. Okay, so here's how do you perform your search. And so one of the things we did not do in this session is to talk about how to use I think that it's called regis and the Boolean operators, and it's somewhere here, right? But there is actually a class, and maybe we can do that in future, where you can be taught how to add all these concepts that you have. So you see at the bottom, we have it here where you say you can add 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. But there are other things that you can do. You can put an asterisk, I forget the terms. You can put an asterisk before, at the end of half a word, and it, anyway, let's move on because of time. So let me move to the next slide because it shows you better what it is we're trying to say here. Okay, look at this one. So think about this. You want to understand, for example, whether people who exercise regularly get stomach cancer compared to people who do not exercise regularly. So if you were to type something in Google, maybe you would type, do adults who exercise regularly get stomach cancer? But think about this. Some people would use exercise. Other people would use physical activity. Some people would say walking, because you remember that people are talking about 10,000 steps. Other people will say running. Some people say weightlifting. Some people will say functional strength training. Some people would say blah, blah, blah. Some people would even say mindfulness exercise, yoga, tai chi, blah, blah, blah. And so if you just say exercise, you may not capture everything because there are other types. So you want to create a table like this, that when you have your question, you break it down and say, what other words would identify my population? So you see adults, some people can use adolescents because we care not just about older people, we care about younger people as well. And think about cancer. So you say stomach cancer, another person says gastric cancer, another person says neoplasms of the upper GI, another person says stomach neoplasms, another person says malignant, another person says malignancy. At the bottom, there's also in PubMed, and I believe in other platforms, there's what you call medical subject headings, MESH. It's how the platform and how the scientific community understands a particular concept to be. So you can see one of the MESH terms for exercise is motor activity. Who would have thought that? If you were thinking about typing into people who exercise regularly get stomach cancer, I doubt that you would have said, does motor activity lead to stomach cancer? So you have to think about the MESH terms, and you can go to PubMed, and maybe Ibrahim would show you in a class. I can't show you. I'm not as good as he is. No, just kidding. I think I might be able to show you. But let's move on. So now you've gotten all these, your studies, you've gotten 1,000 studies, and you've gotten them from 3 databases. So of course, there will be there will be duplicates if you get one from Google Scholar, one from PubMed, one from Embase, and so on. And so you want to manage them, you want to pull them into one place, and you want to manage them. Okay, so this is what happens when you look at Excel. So I'm going to tell you, you do not have to copy and paste, which is such a great thing to know. When you find these studies on PubMed, you can download you can see that this is number, author list, year, and you can, PubMed can download the abstracts, the year of publication, the author, there's this number, what's the number called? It's not MCID, no, it has a name, a number. It can download all of that.
DOI.
Sorry?
DOI.
So the DOI is the internet, like where you find it, but there's a publication number. If you open PubMed and you look at, I don't remember the number, it's MCID keeps coming to my head. If anyone remembers, you can type it in the chat.
PMID.
DMID?
Yes,
PMID. Okay, great. So that number, it would download that number into Excel, and then you can start looking for duplications. If two of those numbers, if you sort and those two numbers are the same, then you know that that's a duplication and you just take that out. Okay, and so Zotero. So I recently started using Zotero. I'm very, very impressed. I think my EndNote, I've always used EndNote, and it kind of crashed, or it crashed, and I didn't know what to do. So I was like, okay, everyone talks about Zotero, and oh my God, it's really, really good. The site, as you write, and look, we have highly recommend. So yes, 5 stars out of 5. And this is how it looks. It's really pretty. I think that somebody who was tired of academia, or who's not as academic as other academics, decided to do this Zotero because it's a lot better. Oh, peep this name. You see this name here? Anyone recognize this guy? Oh, okay. So so now you've pulled all your data into your Excel and whatnot, and you have it in your Zotero, of course, or your EndNote. Now you have to prepare your data. Oh, this is a really, really nice table. So this is the Prisma flow chart, and you can see, give me 1 second, there's stuff on my own screen. That's okay, so nothing's been blocked. So you've identified all your studies, and then you have PubMed, you got 1,000, Embase, you got 2,000, Google Scholar, you got 3,000, and then records removed with duplicate records. We talked about that already. Stanley, can you mute yourself, please? And then you say, okay, we identified 2,000 duplicates. Some of them are ineligible, records removed for whatever reason. And this whatever reason could be, you find one of them is a letter to the editor. And so, and in the next one, it is the actual manuscript for that paper. And so you want to remove one because maybe it's the same data that is being presented in both situations. And then you now go to the screening. So we'll talk about what you do for screening, and then of course you'll be excluding until you arrive at your until you arrive at the final inclusion. So we're going to talk about inclusion and exclusion as we move along. So let's move. Okay, so this is this is how you start. This is how it started, and this is how it's going. So let's move. Okay, so so we've talked about this, and so you can also check the YouTube videos if you need more. So I told you that PubMed can pull this stuff into Excel easily, and maybe EndNote and Zotero. Maybe you need to check up on YouTube how to do that. So please go ahead and do it. I want to say something that for a lot of these things, the greatest problem is the inertia to start. Once you start and you do it, you're going to be like, oh, this is so easy. Why did I not do it in the first place? That's a note to myself. I have to tell myself that as well. Okay, so we're talking about inclusion and exclusion criteria. So you have to know what you're including and what you're not including. So remember I mentioned something about, are we looking at adolescents and adults? Are we looking at only adults? Many times you want to start and understand how this thing works in adults. Of course, if it is not like particular to children, and if it's particular to children, think about childhood cancers, you know, you want to exclude people who are adults because we also see those cancers in adults. If you want to understand how this thing affects children, so your exclusion criteria will take out adults. Okay, so here's this funny line, and which is really, really, don't catch yourself doing this. If you have included a factor in the inclusion criteria, you don't need to list its opposite in the exclusion criteria. So if you say we're going to look at people aged 18 and above, you don't go and say, oh, we're going to exclude people 17 and younger. You've already said the complement of 18 and above is 17 or is 17.999 and below. So don't do that, right? So you can say we're going to include adults 18 to 80. That's an inclusion criteria. So if they're older than 80, you don't want to include them. Your exclusion criteria would be, we will exclude people who are pregnant, especially if you're looking at how drugs work. You don't want to start by including women who are pregnant or people who are pregnant because that could, the results could be different. Or we would exclude people who have very, very high disability with mental health issues. And so that is an appropriate exclusion. Mahmoud, can you mute yourself, please? Okay, so let's move from here. I'm going to pause here and say, does anyone have any questions? So I'm looking at the chat. Yes.
Yes, good evening.
Yes, sir.
Yes, Doc, please, I would like to know, is there, just can you put us through if we can have a video or how when we download from PubMed, how it's going to extract all those things directly? Is it going to extract all those things directly into Excel, or we would have to create all those things ourselves and start to cut and paste?
It would extract directly into Excel. So at the end of this session, maybe we at the end of this session, we can show, okay. I can show a demonstration.
Please, that would be great, Doc.
Yes,
Yes,
it's PMID. Thank you to the people who posted that in the chat. Yes, MCID. No, it's not MCID. Okay, PMID. Great, thank you. Timothy Kintu and Umar and Londe MD. Okay, so after these three people ask their questions, we will move and go forward. Okay, talk to me.
Thank you. So my concern is about papers out there that are not written in English. Does it introduce a certain kind of bias? Because if I'm doing my analysis and I only know English, I am going to leave out papers in Spanish, French, or Chinese. Yes.
So it could introduce a type of bias. The extent to which it will introduce the bias, we can't tell, and there are many arguments for this. So are we thinking that if a study is done in Russian or Chinese or Dutch, are we thinking that it will be different from it being done in Angola, or, and people can argue different ways. People would say biology is biology, human biology is biology, there would be no difference. Another person would say cultural context matter, so there might be differences. Another person might say, well, we don't know how this disease interacts, where there are, different things and blah, 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 and so on. But we generally agree that there might be biases. And so people would say we included only studies published in the English language, and everybody understands this. I was recently working on a paper for that was used to support something in Brazil, and I thought that it was going to be published in Portuguese, but whoever the person who was in charge made sure to publish it in English as well. So I think that a lot of people understand that your paper will be excluded if it's not published in English. So there are people doing that. Okay, let's move to the next person.
All right, good evening.
Go ahead, please.
All right, you made mention of the minimum number of databases we can perform our search. I mean, if we at any point limit the number of databases to 3, wouldn't that at any point introduce a bias?
So we said at least 3, so 3 or more. So yes, that is correct. You may limit yourself, but 3 or more, at least 3 it should be 3 or more. Let's take
Can
one
I
more
say,
question.
sorry, quickly,
Yes.
the question of the databases is also a resource and issue, right? Like it depends on what databases you have access to. And very often if you have PubMed and you have 1 or 2 more databases, you can almost be sure that you have all the papers that you would need. In any case, whatever you do, after you have identified all the papers through systematic search, we usually do hand searching. So through hand searching, you would go through Google Scholar, you look at what papers you might find, then you look at the reference lists of the papers that you're including and look to see if there are additional papers that you can find. Because the reality is that a lot of people who do research in developing countries cannot have access to more than PubMed and Google Scholar, right? Maybe if you can have access to something else, that's great, but this is just the reality of the work that we do. So you would have to find your papers through other means, even if you have a limitation of which databases your institution is paying for. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And I see that there are questions about time, and this is a really good thing. So when I was looking through these slides, one of the things I said is it Pico? Is it Picomte? Is it Pico with a T? And some people use Pico with a T, and the T has time. So we want to look at whether, I'm getting tired of this example, people who eat roasted peanuts get throat cancer. But you will say, I want to look at the evidence between 2000 and 2022. Some people say, I want to look at any evidence at all, and this becomes relevant for time becomes important when maybe the treatment, the kinds of treatments have changed. So in systemic lupus, for example, for 50 years up till I think the year 2000, 2010, there were no actual specific drugs for lupus. We're throwing everything from corticosteroids to anti-malarials and lupus. But in 2011, a new drug came out. And so you might say, I want to look at how patients are doing after this new innovative drug that is specific to lupus is on the market, and that would guide your time. Otherwise you want to look at all periods. So let's move on, and Dr. Ibrahim is answering the questions in the chat, so big ups to him, and I will check from time to time as well. Okay, so
I wonder if you want to take a quick break, if you think it might be helpful for the class.
Okay, why don't we do that?
Okay,
5 minutes or how long?
Yeah, 5 minutes is great. We can start at the when the hour begins again. Yeah. So I see a hand raised. If you want to ask it now, that might be okay. Otherwise, we can wait until the class returns.
Okay, so I think I'll just ask my question.
Okay.
Yeah. So if for example I am doing my study selection and I come across one of my studies, it's already is systematic review.
Yeah.
Do I have to include that study as part of the studies I'm using for the meta-analysis, or do I exclude it?
You have to exclude it. Because we don't include systematic reviews in a meta-analysis. But what you typically do is that you will set it aside and you would make sure that all the papers in that review, that you have found them from your own search, right? And that if you're including them, you know why. If you're not including them, you know why. So when you find a systematic review that answers the same question as yours, you're not including it in your review, but you're noting it so that you can factor it in and make sure that you have found the papers that you should find. So typically, we'll just look through the reference list of the review, look at the papers that they have included, that kind of thing.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Yeah,
and if it answers the exact same question that you are asking, then you would have to consider that your review is an update of that. instead of saying, oh, we saw a systematic review, but we're going to do our own.
Exactly. So yeah, exactly right. So, so then the question is whether you should be doing it at all if it's a recent review. So if somebody has just published a review in 2022, then you want to start your own now, it's going to be a waste of everybody's time.
Yeah, I think I was going to say that that's one of the reasons why they should register the study on Prisma.
Yeah. Exactly. Correct. Yeah. Yeah, I see other hands. We're just waiting for the class to start. So if you want to wait until the rest of the class is back to ask your question, that's great. Otherwise, you can ask now. So,
okay.
Londe, go ahead.
Sir.
I think Londe unmuted himself. Let's hear him, and then we can go to Busayo. I think that's something, yeah.
Okay, good evening, everyone. My question is, the first question is just a follow-up from the previous question. Like, how long is it advisable, the time period? Like, if I see a systematic review that was done 5 years ago, can I still do an update on it? That's the first question, like the duration that is advisable. The second question is concerning the search. If, like we said, some of the papers in PubMed are not freely accessible, the full text articles. So if I come across such a paper and I'm unable to purchase the full text article, am I allowed to exclude it and put it as a limitation to my study, or how do I go about that? If I have a paper that I only have access just to the abstract, but it's part of my inclusion papers.
Okay, so the first question is about time since when a review is done. The second one is about full text. Ebuwa, I'm just giving you some time off so that you can rest. Otherwise, if you want to answer the questions, that's great.
Oh, no, you go and then I can add. That's fine.
Okay. So if a review has been published before, the key question is whether there is additional papers that you can add that can allow you to actually improve upon the work that was done before. So it's not, time is important, but time is not the most important factor. It is whether there are new papers that have been published. So if somebody if there was a review that was published in 2022 or 2021, and there have been a substantial number of studies since then, right? Such that if you add those papers, either there have been many more papers, or there's maybe one new large high impact paper that has been added to the question, such that if you do a new meta-analysis, you would improve upon the work, then it makes sense to go ahead. Otherwise, there's no point. So that's the first one. The second one is with regards to full text. And I think that if we get to that point, Ebuwa will talk about it a little more. If you can't find the full text of the paper, you have to try your utmost best to find it. So that means reaching out to your friends at other institutions who might have access to other libraries, reaching out to the authors. Very often, if you email the authors that you want the full text of their paper, they will send it back to you. So you can do a number of things, but you don't just raise your hand and say, okay, I tried. But after you have tried everything, then you can exclude it, but you will have to explain it in your methods and say, I've tried to find this paper, I didn't find it, right? This is a limitation of my study, but you have to explain and you have to cite the paper that you're missing. Okay, all right.
Okay, we are back. And just to add to Ibrahim's answer, the resources saying, oh, we're unable to pay for this paper is not a solid or acceptable reason to exclude a paper. And this comes to the question, Ibrahim and I, we discussed looking at how does a trial run, or how does research run operationally? And it's not enough to understand the concepts. you also have to have the operationalization aspect. And my advisor was telling me that in the US, it takes for you to do a really solid systematic review and analysis at policy level, it takes close to $500,000. And so it would be wise to take the words of the philosopher who said, if you want to build a castle, make sure you count the money in your pocket first. Okay, so that said, let's move forward. Let's move forward. We are on inclusion and exclusion, and we've discussed that. And let's see. Okay, so I think I missed one. Nice. Okay, so here the study selection is done in 2 rounds. But let me say something else to the first person. You don't need to get the full manuscript for every paper you find in your search strategy. Because like I was saying, and like we will attempt to show, in PubMed you can download the abstracts, and from the abstracts you can tell whether this paper meets your PICO criteria. So, and this is where you get to the study selection. So it's done in 2 rounds. So you read the titles. So for example, you can read a title that says the effects of roasted peanuts on throat cancer in rats. So you don't even need to read the abstract. You're going to take that out automatically. You see, so you are screening the titles, you're screening the abstracts. Now you get into the abstract, maybe the abstract does not say in rats or in mice. But when you're reading the abstract, you find out that it's an in vitro, their samples are in vitro. That means they tested it in a test tube or in a lab. But your question is in adults. And so you say, okay, I don't want in vitro studies, especially because in vitro studies are not reported, and correct me if I'm wrong, but they are not reported at the participant level. They are reported at the sample level. They kind of combine all the samples and say, here's what we see across all the samples instead of across all the people. So maybe that's not suited for what you are doing. So you see, you screen the titles, you screen the records, you've checked the PMID number, and then you've seen which of them are duplicates. So you remove the ones that are not clearly relevant. And then the next thing you do, you can see over here, you have reviewer 1 and reviewer 2. So 2 people, blinded or irrespective of each other, now go through the work. So suppose reviewer 1 says, I don't think this paper by Percy should be included, but reviewer 2 says, well, I believe the paper by Percy should be included. Both of you can sit down and say, okay, tell me why you disagree, tell me why you agree. In Nigerian language, you will say it's not fight, it's a discussion. So you discuss why you agree. And if both of you do not agree on your disagreement, you can have a third person break the tie. If both of you agree, and then you would say, okay, let's take it out or let's leave it in. Okay, so that's it. So you see how you're doing, you are systematically reviewing the evidence, which is different from a review a doctor or a nurse decides that, oh, I'm going to write about breast cancer and what we're seeing in this environment. Okay, so now that you've removed the duplicates, you've disagreed, you've agreed, you've used the third researcher, now you move to round 2. So I think this is a repeat of what we just said. So now you've decided that, okay, these are the studies that are going to move in. A point to note here is, even if you don't agree that whether they should go in or they should not go in, let's say your third person is unable to break the tie or whatever, you still want to include it, and you're going to see why, because it's better to err on the side of caution. Whereas the studies that you all agree should not go forward will not go forward. And now that you've reviewed the abstracts and the titles and look for duplication and all, now this is a time where you start reading the full paper. And now that you do this, you're able to say, okay, bearing in mind our inclusion and exclusion criteria, let's read this paper and let us find out whether they should go forward. And you can see here, you have reason for exclusion. And so, for example, in the tea study that I did, one of the reasons was that we were looking at black tea, but I don't know if you guys know that there's so many different types of tea. There's green tea, there's oolong tea, there's yerba, there's blah, 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 all those things. So we said, okay, let us exclude, even though those are teas, let us exclude and keep only black and green teas. So you have your reasons for exclusion. And of course, these two people do it and you have the same discussion, agreement, disagreement. Okay, so when you've done that, there's another round. Can you imagine? It's called data extraction. And in your data extraction, you're basically, oh, pick this name, this guy's full of himself, isn't he? He's putting all his own, oh, it's the reviewer. Oh, he's not the person who wrote the paper, but yes, I'm still going to say, isn't he full of himself, putting his name in the work? But let's move on. Oh, that was a joke, by the way. So the next thing you want to do is, remember we talked about your PICO, but we also talked about causal estimates. So let's go over this very quickly. You have your, when you read the paper, you now want to extract relevant data, not just any kind of data. You have the author and the year. So suppose you were looking at 2000 to 2022, if Rukuni made their paper in 1999, you know that, of course. And then who's the reviewer? Reviewer one is this guy here. And then in what country was this done? What was the study design? Do you want to take only randomized controls, or do you care about observational studies? What was the population? All pregnancies in the Aberdeen maternal and neonatal data bank between 95 and so you can see how specific this is. And then what year did the study commence? What was the sample size? What was how many of them were comparators and how many of them got the intervention? What was the mean age? I'm not sure what BSI definition is, but how was I'm assuming this is the intervention. How was the intervention defined? So some people would say in the tea study, some people say 12 grams of caffeine, other people would say 4 cups of tea. So how was it defined? And since this is a pregnancy related study, what was the gestational age of the mother, and so on. And so you have to pull all these records into your Excel sheet, because now you're going to look at heterogeneity. You're going to examine, does this really meet our inclusion and exclusion criteria? And you can also see here we have what confounding factors were considered, what statistical model were used, what are potential bias, and we'll come to that. Okay, let's move on. So you can see why it takes a lot of work and why my advisor was telling me that at policy level, it takes as much as $500 million to do a very rigorous analysis that informs government policy. Okay, so should we skip this? I think we talked about this a little. Let's look very quickly, see if there's anything that we need to highlight. So this line is very important. So exposure and outcome variables should be as comparable as possible. So remember when I was saying 12 grams of caffeine. So some people were giving caffeine pills, and other people were asked to drink tea, but tea is not only caffeine, right? Tea contains other things. So are those comparable? Maybe not. Maybe you want to take that. But look at this duration of exposure. So did they drink tea for 12 years, 1 year, 6 months, 2 weeks, you know? And so you want to extract, oh, look at this MCID. I like this word. MCID is minimum clinically important difference. And we can talk about that I think I talked about that if you've gone through the other classes that we've done. Okay, so what do we do about missing data? And I really like this table. I'd almost never seen anybody put a table together like this. So take some time, look at this table. What do you do if you are looking for a standard error? if we had time, I would have said what's the difference between standard error and the standard deviation, but we don't have time. So if you're looking for a standard error, but what you have is a 95% confidence interval, this is the formula that you use. You divide by 3.92. Who would have thunk it? But there you go. So you don't have to say, you could say, oh, this study is not the same with the studies I'm looking for because they presented information. They did not present the standard error, which is the SE. You can do the formula yourself. One of the things in that T study was the way cholesterol was presented. Milligrams per DL versus millimoles per liter, and we just had to divide, or I think multiply by a number. I don't remember. So this is a good resource that you can save in your OneNote or wherever it is that that you save stuff. But there's also the do nothing. You can list it and say, well, these papers were the results were presented in this way, and so maybe they were excluded, or we could not do anything with them. Do nothing is good. But Ibrahim has already said, do everything you can to get the paper and to understand the paper. Sometimes you might have to go to the protocol where it's registered on Prospero to understand what their intention was, because not everything makes it into the paper. You know, the paper is a certain limit of words or certain length, and not everything can make it into the paper. So you can reach out to them. Okay, so let's go.
Sorry, I think you raised a very important point. That is data that is not presented and that's not necessarily missing, right? You say sometimes some things don't make it into the paper, they're in the protocol. It's always important to reach out to the authors. There have been times when we have reached out to the authors for an analysis they did not do, but that we know that they have data for, right? You know that based on the way that the data that they have collected, they must have data for this thing. Maybe they have hemoglobin, but they don't have anemia categories. You can email the authors, and people are often gracious enough to send you the data that you are missing, okay? So it's very important for you to try. Thank you.
Right. Great, excellent. And if you're a student, people are very happy to respond to students. So you say University of Lagos student looking for extra data as your title, you know, and that's what my advisor used to tell me. Because once you graduate, if you say Dr. Lawan is asking for data, you say, oh, Dr. Lawan, you can go kick rocks. Okay, let's move to study quality. But Ibrahim said authors are usually very gracious. So hopefully that will be your experience. Okay, let's move to study quality. So study quality is now, after you've extracted your data, you want to understand, and very quickly, so we've talked about this, right? Study quality can lead to bias. So what if, for example, they said, oh, just drink tea. And it's like, should I drink 1 cup? Should I drink 2 cups? Should I drink 3 cups? How long should I drink it for? And if that detail is not there, then you know that the results are also going to be as uncertain as the exposure. So you want to check for the quality of the study. And you are doing that. And what is in technical terms, how do I know this study is of good quality? It's the extent to which the study results or the study methods introduce bias in the study results. So we have standard scales have been created, and we're going to look at a couple as we go. Okay, so very quickly, let's look at the different types of biases that can be introduced in the studies that you have. I'll explain 1 or 2 just because of time. But we do have a session recorded that I presented, and I watched it online. I was like, oh boy, you did a good job. So if I might say so myself, I recommend you go watch explanations of the different types of biases. But let's talk about confounding very quickly as a bias. I think we're going to go into that in a couple of slides. So okay, let's move forward. And if there you go, it's confounding. If we have time, I can tell you a little bit about selection bias and recall bias, blah, blah, blah. But okay, so very quickly, confounding is that bias. Confounding is that very troublesome person that every time there's trouble, you can be sure they'll find their fingerprints there, confounding. And confounding is basically, if you're looking at the relationship between an exposure and an outcome, again, we're using a very horrible example, roasted peanuts and throat cancer. And maybe that's a thing. I don't know. Maybe it came to me in a dream. Who knows? Can someone do a quick check and see whether there's knowledge on that? And so you have roasted peanuts and throat cancer. And you say, well, I think there is a relationship there. But maybe the people who eat roasted peanuts also eat roasted fish that has the gills in there. So I believe that people who, because their practice for food preservation is roasting. So they roast everything. They roast fish, they roast peanuts. And because those people are doing the same thing, they roast the peanuts, they roast their fish, and those two things may be causing throat cancer. Maybe roasted peanuts do not cause throat cancer as much because those people have a relationship between roasting of fish and roasting of peanuts. And roasting of fish and roasting of peanuts can cause throat cancer. Your roasting of fish would be a confounder in that relationship between your roasting of peanuts and throat cancer. And in life generally, characteristics tend to go together. People who drink a lot also tend to either smoke cigarettes a lot or do some other kind of recreational drugs a lot, so things kind of go together. It's not the absolute truth, but things kind of go together, and you have to be able to pick them up and say, let's make sure that it is not this second thing that's going along. And it's not only two things, they're called potential confounders. So there is a lot of things, let us make sure that we are not looking at an effect that is caused by some other things that confound the relationship or are associated with the exposure. Okay, so keep the questions in the chat, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to address them. Okay, so how do we address confounding? And I like this. There are 5 main ways of addressing confounding. So look at this beautiful but very simple thing here. So this, I'm going to explain this in 2 ways. One of the things in confounding, for example, is that a confounder is not along the causal pathway. And this is not what this diagram is meant to, or maybe it's meant to do it, but I'm going to use this to explain it. Suppose you start smoking in your teens. You will be predisposed to chronic diseases like diabetes. And because of that, and because of diabetes, you are likely to get an MI. But imagine that this relationship was more time bound, like you start smoking today, next 2 weeks you get diabetes, and the other next 2 weeks you get acute MI. Just imagine that for a second. Then diabetes is not necessarily a confounder of the relationship between smoking and acute MI. Diabetes would be called a mediator. It is along the causal pathway. And so you don't want to control for mediators. That's a quick thing that you want to note, and then we can explore further, right? But at the same time, let's imagine that smoking was not exactly related with diabetes, but maybe, and this is a bad example, but maybe people who smoke also tend to have diabetes, and people who smoke tend to have acute MI, and people with diabetes also tend to have acute MI. Then diabetes becomes a confounder. So you have to be on the lookout and say, is this a confounder or is this a mediator? Some people talk about colliders and confounders, and you can check that out. It's a very interesting read. But very quickly, what do you do? And the first thing is you match. So, and this may not exactly apply to systematic lit reviews because you're reviewing studies that have already been done. But perhaps in the meta-analysis portion, you can also do the matching. Someone else would take care of that in subsequent. But just think about if you're looking at and let me pause and say this. And when you're reviewing your studies, you can determine whether there's confounding in the study. Okay, so let's just move on and talk about matching. So if you wanted to do if you were looking at the effects of smoking on lung cancer, so you would say, I'm looking at people who smoke, people who don't smoke. But if there's a 50-year-old male who smokes, I want to select a 50-year-old male who does not smoke, as opposed to just any random person who does not smoke. That's matching. Restriction is exactly what we said. We want to look only at 50-year-olds who smoke and see whether the incidence of cancer. So you restrict it to only 50-year-olds. So some people will say, well, restriction is not representative of the population. It's true, but we are restricting our research to this particular set of people. So it's not a bias. Restriction is actually a way to control for confounding. Randomization, of course. If you take a population, you select randomly and you randomize, then subpopulation A is equal to subpopulation B, and subpopulation A and B, or subpopulation A or B, is equal to the general population. And this is why people are very confident about causation, their estimates of causation, because they are looking at the characteristics in the population. And then you can have multi-linear regression. Some people call it multivariate regression, but that's the wrong thing. It's a multivariable regression. And that controls for adjustments. And then there's the really nice things of inverse probability weighting, propensity score matching, and I'm sure Ibrahim will be happy to tell you guys about those. Okay, so assessing quality assessing the quality of studies. Yes. So remember that we said it's a very objective, very standardized way for doing it. And you can see there are tools. So the Cochrane risk of bias, I believe Cochrane risk of bias has 8 domains, and you have to, for each paper that you select into your study, you're going to say, how do they fare on this domain? It's high quality, low quality, poor quality. And you do that for 8 domains. And then at the end, you're able to say, based on these, I believe that the quality of this paper is medium quality or low quality. And you also have, it for a randomized control trials, you have it for non-randomized control trials. There are others, the Newcastle Ottawa scale. So this comes from, I believe will come from either Canada or the UK. And these, and so feel free.
Evo.
Yes.
Oh, are you here, please?
Luther, can you mute yourself? Oh, I thought it was Ibrahim talking. So feel free as you're developing your careers to come up with the Nigerian scale. You know, we will support you. We will use it. By the way, there's a tool called Rayan. Rayyan. It's created by the Qatari government, you know, and it's becoming very, very popular. You should check it out. It's very, very easy to use. And so put your different countries on the map by doing great work. Don't just be a user, you be a contributor. And that is also notes to myself. So you can see by the time you use this Cochrane or the Ottawa scale, you can, okay, look at the domains here. You can look at all your studies. So these are the studies on the left, and these are the different domains that you are assessing for. So let's pick a random paper, something done by Carter, and then you say random sequence generation. So we're talking about selection bias here, and you say question mark. It means we're not sure. They did not tell us how well or if they did it. Allocation concealment. Did people know that they would be in the intervention group or not in the intervention? They did not also tell us. So in this case, if you see that it is not told in the paper, it does not mean it's not done. Maybe you go and check the protocol. Maybe you email them. Why? Because not everything can make it into the paper. Just because you cannot see does not mean it's not done. And then these guys, blinding of participants, they are certain that these guys did not blind the participants. So you see it's a red minus. And these are, so let me ask Ugochi, can you unmute yourself? Just tell us very quickly, if you had this paper that had positive, 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 positive 4, 1 negative, and 2 we do not knows. will you say this is a high quality paper, or is this a low quality paper? Or a medium quality paper?
I would say it's a high quality paper.
Okay, what of Jinandi? Will you say it's a high quality paper or a low quality paper?
It's a low quality paper for me.
Okay, so does anybody agree with Ugochi, or does anyone disagree with Ugochi that this is a high quality paper? Everybody agrees? No contrarian in the group? That's good. Okay, so but let's look at this one on the right. So here, this is a little different from what we have on the left, right? So you can see on the left, we're looking at the different studies. But on the left, what we're looking at is we're looking at all our studies together, and we're looking at the domain. So here we're saying that let's look at this first one. For selection bias, we're saying about 95%, I assume this is 95 or 90, have low risk of bias. So for all the papers we have looked at, 95% of them do not have any evidence of selection bias, whereas only 5%. But for blinding, I wonder why. Maybe, who knows, but only 15% or 20% have low risk of bias for blinding. So again, Ugochi, now you're still on the spot. Tell me, what overall, across all the papers looked at, what would you say about the quality of the studies that we examined based on this table? High, medium, low?
For all of them?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so for the first one, I would say it's a high quality paper.
Oh, you want to make a generalization?
Okay, a generalization. Oh, okay.
Yes.
I'll say a medium quality paper because of the if you can see on the third one, the blinding bias is like almost 90%.
Okay, does anybody disagree? You need to have at least one person disagreeing here. Anybody? Please, unmute yourself, Mukhtar.
I'm unmuted.
Okay,
can you hear me?
Tell me, agree, disagree?
I disagree.
And what do you think?
I think it's a high quality, generally I will say.
And
if you look at the greens,
Miriam?
The greens are really more than the reds. So you don't expect it to be 100%. So if it's just a selection bias that had that deficiency, for all the others, it's really
excellent. So you see that here there's no right or wrong answer. What I want to let you know is, despite the fact we've called this objective, standard, tools, blah, 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 you see that at the end, it is quite subjective, right? Because Ugochi has said, because of this red, we have to penalize them. Maybe we'll give them a medium quality. But Miriam has said, look at all these greens. Oh my God. And then somebody else might say, well, do we really need the participants to be blinded? I suppose it was people with jaundice versus people without jaundice. If you have jaundice, there's no need to blind, you know, and is the blinding so important? And maybe they would go with Mariam. And you know, some other person can say, look at this selection bias. This is the key issue for bias in these studies. As long as we have very solid or very low risk of selection bias, we are going to say this is these studies were generally of high quality with low risk of bias. So you can see that depending on, there are two ways you can do it. You can look at the papers, but even with this method, you still have to come up and tell us, you know, what do you think about the paper overall? All of this. Okay, so let's move on. And now we get to where you present the quality of the study. So moving on. Yeah, okay, so look at this. Risk of bias, moderate. So you can see, just as we were saying earlier, there is no tool that helps you decide whether it's, there is a tool that helps you decide, but there's no tool that helps you conclude conclusively. Another forgot what's that word is. Tautology, yes, that's the word. that helps you conclude conclusively that that the overall study is moderate or low. It's a little bit subjective. But of course, you have researcher 1, researcher 2, and the third person who breaks the tie, who says, I agree, I disagree. Okay, so we are at the end of this, and we've done it in good time. We have about 15 minutes to answer questions, to revisit slides and whatnot. And also, I think that someone has asked us to, or a couple of people have asked to show the PubMed, the PubMed thing. And so at this point, if we want to stop the recording, that's fine. Or if we want to add the discussion session to the recording, that's fine as well. So why don't we ask questions of everyone who has, why don't we have a discussion for anyone who has questions?
So if you have questions, please raise your hand. This might be a good time to, go over the things that are not clear from this session, but also things that are not clear from previous, the recordings that you have seen. This is a good opportunity to do that.
Okay, I see Uma has their hand up. Please go ahead and ask a question.
All right, thank you very much for the session. I just want to ask if this recording can be gotten immediately after the presentation. Thank you.
It won't be immediately, but we'll get it to you as soon as possible. Yes.
So someone has asked in the chat, how do we know how do we know if a variable is not in the causal pathway? And the reason why I laugh is because that question is a very good question, and it actually asks other questions. And basically, before you do research in a topic, you want to know as much about the topic as possible. And remember when we said, when I said that the estimate for at policy level is about 500,000. And so this question has beyond the technical aspect. So suppose you're a researcher and you're not a medical doctor, but you want to do a medical question. You either want to spend time reading up on that area, or you want to get to partner and pay for the time of the medical experts. So you see where your resources go to, and also the operationalizing of these studies. One thing you have to know is you cannot do this stuff by yourself. This results in low quality outputs. And you have to be conscious of that. Do you need a statistical expert? Do you need a key opinion leader? Do you need a subject matter expert? Do you need people who will implement the data collection? So you have to keep that in mind. Okay, let's go back to people who raised their hands, and I will continue to look through the chat and answer questions.
Hello. Hello.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Regarding the issue of making a final decision on whether a paper can be said to be of high quality, moderate quality, or low quality, I said it's quite subjective. So I was wondering, is it possible to get an average score? For example, when it comes to issue of bias, let's say the paper scores 70, low risk of bias, let's say it has a percentage. So we can add all these percentages, and let's say, or if there's a score, and divide them by the total number of different issues, let's say bias, issue of randomization, or different aspects. If we can get a harmonized score, can't we create a range of values where we can say this should be considered low quality, moderate quality?
Yes, you can absolutely do that. But remember, like, it's you who's coming up with your range. So that's what makes it subjective. So subjective does not mean that you, subjective does not mean that that it is poorly done or whatever. It means that you are the one using your best guess as a reasonable, enlightened person.
And I just want to also say that, you know, the most critical thing about the bias is that you report your methods, let the reader know how you have come up with, you know, what you're doing. And that makes it as objective as possible. It's not going to be perfectly objective, but if you let us know this is what you did, then it gives the reader some understanding of what went into the methodology, into the methods that you use. And you also report, you know, like in the charts that Ebuwa showed. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hello.
Okay, who's next?
Yes, McQueen.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you so much for the enlightening session. My question concerns the comparator looking at the PICO chart. Can we have more than one comparison? Like, can we have more than one comparator group? For example, I want to check the clinical of herbs on breast cancer, for example. Can I compare against orthodox medicine and also against placebo? That's if there is a clinical trial.
So you would you're thinking about having two comparators, right? So you would say
yes,
this versus this and this versus that. I think that you can do that. Ibrahim, what do you think? I think you can do that. It will throw in, you will be doing two studies in one. And but I don't think that that's a bad thing to do, or I don't think there would be any errors if you compare against two different comparators or more than two different comparators.
So if my mind had trailed off for a moment, I think the question is whether we can have more than one comparator in a study, right?
Okay, not
is
in
that
the
question?
Analysis.
In the meta-analysis, right?
Yes.
Right. Okay. So the thing is that if you go back to the point that Ebuwa made earlier, that your exposure and outcome have to be as comparable as possible. So the question you have to ask yourself is, these two comparators, can I assume that they are the same thing? If you cannot assume that they are the same, then it won't make sense to include them in the same meta-analysis. It's better to do separate meta-analysis for them. You can have multiple comparators in the same study, but you will have to have different meta-analysis in that study. So in each systematic review, you can have multiple different meta-analysis that have the same exposure outcome relationship. I hope that's clear, but you will.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, all right. So if we go back to the quality assessment, I see a number of questions in the chat, and I just want to address it quickly. And someone asked about weighting and the scoring. So yes, there are methods that would allow us to generate a score, like the JADAD system, for instance. But the reason why we prefer to use something like the Cochrane is because it's transparent. We can see exactly how it's obtained. You know, we can see exactly the quality issues that the study has. If you use a single score, right, it will be impossible for the reader to understand what quality challenges were present. So if you go back to that chart that Ebuwa showed earlier, someone said, oh, blinding, maybe blinding is not as important as, so if you see that all the studies have a low quality because they're not blinded, the reader might decide, okay, maybe I don't care about blinding as much, you know. So, but if you use a single score, then there's opacity. We don't know exactly what went wrong with those studies, you know, and that's why it's helpful to use methods that are explicit, that tell us exactly what the challenges are. Okay.
I'm trying to get to the slide, but please.
Yeah, that one. The one before, yes. So like this one exactly, right? You can see what the challenges are with each study, right? The one on the left. And that allows us to make a decision about, okay, maybe if blinding is the issue, right? Like in the summary on the right, you can see that most of the studies, blinding was the issue with them. And you can decide, oh, I don't really care about blinding. But if the issue was the random sequence generation, if you think that, oh, maybe there's selection bias, and you think, oh, selection bias can really threaten the validity of the findings, then you might decide that, oh, because selection bias is the challenge, I don't believe this meta-analysis. So giving more information is better than giving a single score or a single categorization. But the other point I want to make is we're using the study quality to just inform the reader about the studies. We're not going to make any statistical decisions based on the study quality, right? So that just wanted to put that out. So you don't agonize too much about, oh, maybe there's a different way, maybe there's a different way. It's better to focus on the meta-analysis section where, the decisions that you make will have a critical impact on your findings rather than to agonize too much about the presentation of the study quality. Thank you.
Yeah. And then someone said, can we add non-clinical trials? And the answer to that is it depends on your question. It depends on your inclusion and exclusion criteria. So remember, if we said Cochrane systematic reviews focus only on randomized clinical controls because they believe that those are high standard studies. And so it's really up to you. Okay, let's go to the next person. I see Anthea Katia has their hand up.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity. I have a question related to the search strategy. You have mentioned including Google Scholar. So far from my experience, I found it more complicated to do search in Google Scholar. Sometimes you get 100,000 hits, and downloading references is not so easy as PubMed, for example. Do you have a special strategy how to deal with Google Scholar when you include them in the systematic review?
So personally, I don't have a special strategy for dealing with Google Scholar, but like you said, it gives you so many results that you're like, oh, I think I like that that I have so many results compared to having just limited results. So I don't know what the current academic thing is about whether Google Scholar is acceptable or not acceptable. But Ibrahim, what do you think?
So thanks, Ebuwa. So I have used Google Scholar in practically all the reviews that I have done, and there's quite a few. And what we typically do is use Google Scholar. So not use Google Scholar as a systematic search, but to use Google Scholar to sort of identify additional papers. So you have done your search in PubMed, Embase, Sinal, whatever else. Then you search your terms. Just typically, sometimes I just paste my research question in Google Scholar and look at the questions that come up, right? And typically, I would look at the first 500 hits, or I will keep looking at the papers until I don't find something that I think is relevant. So, with Google Scholar, you will have to look at each hit that you find. Is this relevant? Is that relevant? It's not like with PubMed where you just download everything that you have, right? Here, you will have to look at each one, look at what's relevant until you stop finding papers that are relevant to your search term, or when you get to like a large number of papers, maybe 500, then you stop. So that's what I've typically used Google Scholar for. Anyone else?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, welcome. Other hands are raised, maybe.
Yeah. Thanks for the lecture. In terms of going through available evidence, I've come across having a systematic review of systematic reviews, and it's kind of confusing for me, just in terms of if you're conducting a systematic review, the assumption is you're going to look at all of the literature out there. So what is a systematic review or a systematic review? What does it actually mean?
I think I'm going to push that one to Ibrahim.
So a review or reviews, it's sort of like a confusing terminology, but what people are really doing is, imagine that you have a large research question that has multiple parts to it. And maybe 5 people have already done reviews on those parts. And you want to bring all of those parts together into one question that you then provide a summary of. And I can give an example. So you're doing a review of maybe the impact of micronutrients in pregnancy. I work a lot in this space, so forgive me if that's the example that immediately comes to mind. You might find that people have done the impact of iron supplements on the risk of low birth weight, impact of iron supplements on the risk of pregnancy loss, impact of iron supplement, and maybe they have done like iron supplements on multiple different outcomes, and you want to summarize that. That's typically what people are doing. So you will take all the different reviews and then put them together in one study and write a narrative review around it. So even though it calls itself a systematic review, right, it's not really systematic in the context of like a meta-analysis that we're doing. You're not necessarily subjecting the reviews to a statistical analysis. You're essentially bringing all those together. And often what people will then do is present a figure that summarizes the evidence from all those reviews, and then you can say, oh, maybe if you look at iron and birth weight, this is what the pooled estimate is. If you look at iron and this is what the pooled estimate is. In some cases, and then you begin to get into a space where people start to do different things, right? So in some cases, people might then have one question there's not a meta-analysis that's been done there, and then they quickly do their own new meta-analysis, so you get into a space that is sort of unregulated, and and I wouldn't bother too much about that at this point. If you have a question that has multiple different components to it, it might be okay. And other people have done systematic reviews in that question. You might summarize it in a systematic review of systematic reviews. Otherwise, you can do a systematic review that has its own multiple components. The fact that it's called a systematic review or systematic reviews doesn't mean that it's a better quality study, right? It's just that people have chosen to use that approach. Oftentimes what we have done is instead do our own systematic review, and that allows you to bring in, if there are new papers that have been looked at in that space, you can bring them in, unlike if you're just reporting the work that others have done.
Okay, so we're 5 minutes over time, and I'm wondering if this is a good time to wrap this up. But there's also the showing people how to download into Excel. Yeah. And while the question was going on, Dr. Ibrahim, do you want to take over and show the PubMed interface has changed? I'm wondering whether that feature has been taken off. You can download into a notepad, but I can't seem to find the download to Excel. Okay. Do you know a roundabout way to get there?
Let me, so the reality is that you will always have to, can you see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and you can see PubMed, right? Mm-hmm. The reality is that you will always have to read about things on your own. Like you might need to go on Google, depending on which software you want to use for your analysis. But if we focus on Excel for a moment, and if you say maybe what research question, exercise and gastric cancer, because that's the one we've been talking about all day. So if you do a search on exercise and gastric cancer, and you type that into your PubMed, it has 428 results. The question is, how do you send that to Excel? Now, if you click here, so before we go to that, you can see the display options, can just show you what to show in here. But if you want to send
let's show the abstract with display options so that, yeah, it pulls all the information we need to do the research. Yeah. Okay.
So if you want to send to if you click send to here, it gives you different options: clipboard, my bibliography, collections. If you click citation manager, that can allow you to send it to like Zotero, to EndNote, you know. But if you want to send it to Excel, I believe this is where you will click. And okay, no. So that sends it to collections, which is okay, I think that's wrong. So if you, yeah, save all results, and you can choose whether you want to include the summary or abstract, or if you just wanted to use a PubMed version, and you can create the file. So it will be a notepad. This is what the file would look like. Okay. And you will have to then send this to CSV in some form.
So
there's a
I
little
saw the
bit of
CSV option at the bottom. So maybe
you
that's
did.
yeah, maybe that's the key. I was looking for it as well.
Which one?
Yeah,
Here.
at the bottom.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't see that. Yeah. All right. So if you click CSV, then
Okay. So there you go.
yeah.
That's
So
it.
this is the title, and you would have the abstract. You should have the abstract. You don't have the abstract here, maybe because of the options that we chose. So let's go back. If you save all results and display, okay, I'm not sure why I didn't show the abstract, but there is a little bit of tinkering that you will do that would allow it to show the abstract. What I typically do instead is send it to EndNote or Zotero and then go to Excel from that. I've always found that it will show the abstract, but if you tinker with this settings, you'll be able to figure it out.
So the answer to the question is, what is CSV? And Timothy gave us the technical name. And so that always makes me laugh because anyway, that's another thing. But basically, a CSV file is an Excel file that's saved a little different from what you typically understand Excel to be. So if you have Excel on your computer, it will open it. And if you want to save it as XLSX, you can save as XLSX. And so, and the reason why I said it makes me laugh is if we tell the name and say comma separated value CSV, the next question is, how does it help the person who's asking the question in terms of what they would do next? But okay, we have 2 more questions. I think we should wrap up. We should wrap up soon.
Abbas, you want to ask your question?
Hello.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, it's a contribution. Actually, PubMed, when you are saving it to Excel, it doesn't get saved with the reference. With the abstract, sorry. It doesn't put the abstract in the Excel sheet.
Right.
Except making it as a notepad.
So they recently, maybe a couple of years ago, changed the interface for PubMed, and the old interface you could do that, it looks like you're correct. With the new interface, you can't download the abstracts, which doesn't make a lot of sense. So maybe you might want to, if you want the abstracts as well, you might go the route that Ibrahim uses typically, which is export to EndNote, and then you can find a way to export to Excel. Or you could use the Ryan plugin, which is what I've used in the past. That can open the, I hope it still can open the abstracts as well, and you can review the abstracts on the Ryan website. Yeah, someone is saying Ryan is really cool. So yes, that's someone supporting. Okay, so let's look at the chat quickly and wrap up in the next 4 minutes. Is that okay, Dr. Ibrahim?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so is it just another synthesis of evidence? So I believe that your meta-analysis, your systematic reviews, all that work can be called evidence synthesis analysis. So yes, it's not just another, it's the highest form, you know, of evidence synthesis analysis. So it is a type of evidence synthesis analysis. Is it appropriate to exclude a study with a very high risk of bias from the meta-analysis? I think this is a really good question. And maybe I should push this. I see that I'm pushing all the difficult questions and difficult things to Ibrahim. But
which is what? Which question? Sorry.
Do you exclude a study with a high risk of bias from your meta-analysis?
No.
No.
So because if, like we discussed, the risk of bias, there's a lot of subjectivity involved in how we're identifying studies, how we're classifying the risk of bias. So we typically do not do any statistical decisions in the main analysis, you know, on the risk of bias. So sometimes what you will then do is that you will do a sensitivity analysis. What would happen if I kicked out the studies with high risk of bias? And the reason we don't do it in the main analysis is because what if other people do not agree with you that this study has a high risk of bias? You know, you've essentially done all this work, and your meta-analysis might not be useful for the community. So you want to present multiple different approaches, or just leave everything in and let people decide what they think.
Okay, do we have one more question?
So one question that has come up again and again relates to the age of the papers that you're including. So we typically do not restrict papers based on the time when they were published. If you find a study from 1840 and you can include it, and that's the example I used, you should include it. Unless in some cases, sometimes you have decided that this meta-analysis that we want to do, right, is for studies that were published in the last 3 years. And that's a reasonable question. You might say, oh, we're looking for all the studies that were published in the pandemic era. So in that case, it makes sense for you to institute restrictions on time. But other than that, you know, we don't have restrictions on when the study was published. As long as you can find it, you know, and it meets your inclusion and exclusion criteria, then you add it in.
Okay, so we're at the 2-hour mark, and so I think this is a good time to close.
Yeah, so we will stop the recording. If people have questions, you can stay on. Otherwise, you know, you can. We'll close. And thank you very much for joining today. Any final thoughts, Ebuwa?
Oh, just thank you so much for the opportunity and for taking the time.
Thank you.